Cool, cool. First off, I'm glad to be here from snowy parts of New York City. But yeah, welcome to my talk, The Good, the Bad, and Ugly of Prototyping. And before I kind of get into the actual talk, I kind of want to illustrate, kind of paint a story about kind of my career journey overall. So I've worked in this industry for about 10 years, and a lot has changed and a lot of things have stayed the same. I worked in-house, I worked in agencies, and kind of like my journey has been pretty interesting overall. So I want to kind of talk about like the roles I had in the past and kind of like what inspired me to kind of get to this point. So these are some of the roles I had in the past. I was a web designer, I was a front-end developer, a product designer, front engineer, design technologist, and UX engineer. Obviously, those are like a lot of different roles for one person within the span of 10 years. But for me, it has been kind of an interesting moment. Sorry, 1 second. Seems like it's not loading up right. Okay, it's working now. Cool. So these are kind of the roles I had in the past. But there was one thing that was common throughout all these roles was that like a lot of it involved some sort of prototyping. And it was kind of interesting because I found out that like one of the essential skills for anything from design or front-end development was that you have to be very skillful about how you prototype and how do you have like a process around that. And one of the other interesting things was like, I wasn't taught like how to like properly prototype ideas in school. And it was something that I kind of picked up along the way. But before I dive in deep into prototype in general, I kind of want to have us be on the same ground level about what is prototyping and kind of have a definition for it. So a definition I kind of come up with is kind of similar to, it's a sample application used to test and validate early concepts of a product. And I highlighted test and validate because most often than not, that's what you're really trying to figure out. And usually in the case of like their early concepts and you're trying to make sure that you are building the right solution and be able to kind of validate with real users. So let's get into more about the purpose of prototypes. There's many purposes for prototyping, but I'm kind of gonna outline the top 4. So the first one is to communicate and sell ideas. Often not, we're dealing with stakeholders and colleagues, and you can kind of share ideas and just kind of talk about it verbally, but I'm more in the case where you want to show them and not tell them. So creating prototypes is an effective way to kind of create and sell ideas overall. Second is you want to uncover potential edge cases. There's this notion where edge cases get more expensive further down the line of a product development process. So you want to basically have a case where you have uncover those edge cases as early as possible so you can be more proactive in solving them. Third, we have a faster iteration process. So when you're creating prototypes, it allows you to kind of jump from one idea to another very quickly. And the idea is that you want to move as fast as possible, but also get through as many ideas as possible in a short period of time. And last, be able to test usability early. As I highlighted before, you want to be able to kind of test your ideas before it gets out to the market, and creating prototypes kind of allows you kind of do that in a very effective manner. So now that we talked about the purpose, I kind of want to illustrate some principles I kind of follow when I'm actually prototyping. And there are 4 basic principles. The first principle is value. And often the question I try to solve is like, does the feature or whatever I'm prototyping going to add value and solve problems for the user? Second is usability. Can the users figure out how to use the feature I'm designing? Third is feasibility. Will the engineers be able to build the features within the time, resources, and technology that's available? And finally, we have business viability. Will the solution or feature benefit the business? So now that we got that out the way, the rest of the talk is going to be mainly focusing on 6 key areas, and I'm going to talk about the ugly, the good, and bad for each of them, and kind of tell like stories for all of them. So let's first start with meetings. So I'm not gonna lie, one of the things I don't really like to do is be part of meetings, because I feel that I'm more of like a maker, and I think sometimes some people have like meetings all day, and I try to keep my schedule as light as possible. But let's kind of go through like kind of like the ugly, the bad, and good for each of them. So the ugly, useless meetings. I know we all been there where we kind of had meetings that could have been solved with a Slack message or an email and whatnot. And we have to always keep in mind of this, because oftentimes, especially from managers, but also from IC levels, those times that we are meeting could be used to kind of build features or kind of be able to kind of be more productive. So I think that the best thing to do is making sure that you want to avoid useless meeting as much as possible. And the bad side of this stuff is kind of having unproductive meetings. One story I have about this is that I was part of this meeting, and someone kind of scheduled this meeting, and the person that scheduled the meeting didn't have an agenda, and his first question was, "So what should we talk about?" And what ended up happening was that it was an hour meeting, and we didn't really figure out what to talk about until probably like the 45-minute mark. And then we have 15 minutes to kind of talk about what we're kind of there to kind of talk about. So I think it's always best to kind of avoid these unproductive meetings. And the best way to kind of do this is kind of have an agenda. And if you want to take it a step further, you can have something more along the lines of like having a prototype focused meeting. And what I mean by that is that anytime you're meeting or whatever like that, you want to kind of have the focus be on a prototype. It could be a paper prototype. It could be any kind of prototype that people can kind of look at and give feedback on. Kind of the stuff I've done in the past, whereas like if I know I need feedback on something, is that when I share in a calendar invite, I will send the actual link to the prototype so people can kind of check it out, be able to kind of write down their feedbacks, test drive it, and then when we actually get into the meeting, it allows for a seamless meeting where it could be around 25 minutes. People can kind of give their feedback, and then at the end, we could talk about next steps. One quote that kind of simplifies this into is from basically Tom and David Kelly from IDEO. And they basically illustrate where it's like, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, a prototype is worth 1,000 meetings. And when I heard this, I was like, I'm always going to have prototypes anytime I go, so I could avoid those 1,000 meetings. But that's kind of like the vision I kind of try to be more proactive with, is where if I have some sort of prototype, share it as early as possible and with everyone, so people can kind of really understand what you're doing, but also be more explicit about the type of feedback you're getting, because oftentimes some people get focused on the actual visuals, but you might be looking feedback on like the user flow and whatnot. If you want to like have learn more about this, there's like actual great article about why designers should never go to a meeting without a prototype. Highly recommend, and it's from Tom and David Kelly. So the second one I want to kind of touch on is prototype methods. There are a bunch of different methods you can kind of use to kind of be able to prototype and whatnot. And I'm going to highlight a few of them. But to kind of talk about the ugly side of things, and I would say that the ugly side of things would be using only one method. Early in my career, I actually was trained to like do a lot of web design. So most of the prototyping I did early on was like high fidelity prototypes and whatnot. And I realized that like I was getting frustrated and I was not able to kind of really come up with good experiences because I was off the bat focusing on high fidelity mockups and really focusing on color, layout, and typography. And that really hindered my process to kind of be able to prototype many different ideas. The bad would be using the wrong prototyping method. I've done this in the past too, where again, working using a wireframe or maybe an interactive prototype where I could have been using a paper prototype. So the good would be to understand the use cases for each prototype methods and really hold on to like the benefits and when do you want to use one or the other. So let's kind of talk about like the 4 top prototyping methods I use and when I'll use them. So the first one we have is paper prototype. Paper prototype, I often use it when I'm early in the project. In some cases, I use it for design studios. So if I'm working with stakeholders and other colleagues, what sometimes we would do is that we'll get in the room, we'll kind of figure out a user story to kind of tackle. And then from there, we kind of time box it to say an hour where we come up with different iterations and whatnot. And the great thing about this is that like anyone can participate. You don't have to be a designer or an artist to kind of be able to draw this UI. If you could draw a circle, a box, and just write, you'd be able to do any kind of paper prototyping. And it's probably the most flexible way to do paper prototypes. There's also different variations. So you can do a paper prototype that's like basically just like you're just writing stuff down. A more advanced one would be to like use where you're kind of cutting up like the actual UI and kind of really demonstrating the actual experience. But that's more advanced, but there's many ways to kind of do paper prototyping. Next is wireframe prototype. Wireframe prototype is in a case where you're not really focusing on like the actual aesthetics, but more lines of like the layout and the content. So in this example, I had a case where I knew what kind of content I wanted in specific sections, but there was the FAQ section where I wasn't really sure what should be in there. So I kind of put a placeholder in there. And the great thing about this is that if you have a content strategist person that you're working with, you can really pair on this and kind of say like, tag team the actual content where you can be like, hey, this is the idea I have. I need your help to kind of making sure that it's really talking in the brand voice and tone. Third, we have the static prototype. And this is an example of a vision prototype, but you can use Figma or Marvel and whatnot. And in this case, the main reason why you would use this is that you're more on lines of like making it more high fidelity. You're adding more color. You're really thinking about the aesthetics and whatnot. And these, like in some cases, you probably would stop here. But I like to do more of interactive prototypes, which is kind of like, this is like an example of it. And this is kind of built in front-end code. So I'm using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for this. And the main reason why you would use this prototype method is that you're trying to basically design the best experience possible, and basically trying to be more proactive about like, oh, how does the animation go and whatever like that. And obviously this is probably the most time-consuming prototype method, but there's ways to kind of allow it so that when you're actually like working on features that you're able to kind of bootstrap a interactive prototype very quickly. So now that I talk about like all of those, I actually have a poll that should be coming up. But the poll is just kind of illustrating like what is your favorite prototyping method. I'm just interested to hear like what you all have to say. But one thing I want to communicate is that always the idea should drive which prototype method will be used. And it took me a long time to really understand this because, like I said, most often not early in my career, I always was jumping into either a static prototype using like Sketch or Figma, or I kind of jump into code and start doing like interactive prototype. But I started to realize that there's like kind of like a way to kind of think about this and one prototype method should you use over another. And this is based off this kind of diagram I have. So just to kind of talk about it, we have on the y-axis kind of the concept confidence, and then on the x-axis we have the different prototype methods. So if you're not really confident about like the concept of the idea you have, you want to choose a more flexible prototype method. So this is a paper prototype or a wireframe prototype. And if your confidence is really high and you really think this idea is pretty good, then you can kind of use one of the high fidelity prototypes, kind of like a static prototype or an active prototype. So that's basically prototype methods. The next part I want to kind of talk about is prototype strategy. And again, the ugly will always be that having no strategy at all. As I was stating before, there would be cases where I would just kind of prototype for no reason and just kept on prototype. And I have an example later in the talk that kind of illustrates that. But kind of like when you have no strategy, you have no plan. You basically when the idea is like when you're failing to plan, you're planning to fail. So that's kind of the mentality I started to figure out. And another thing, which is the more about the bad, is that prototyping without a purpose. You always want to keep in mind about like why you're doing it, like why you're prototyping. What question are you trying to solve? What solution are you trying to solve? And be very clear about that. And I want to kind of show. Hopefully this shows up pretty good. And to give some context about what I'm showing, I was working on this financial application, and we did a lot of like front-end prototypes and whatnot. And as you can see, some of them were like pretty bad idea. We thought about having this view show up where a graph will be the first thing you see with like no context and whatnot. And this was probably like a pretty bad idea. But overall, this project was it was a long project. We did around like 17 different iterations of the actual front-end prototype, and you could actually see like the layout is like totally different and whatnot. And even though this is probably like one of the my favorite projects, I could kind of see that there was some things that we actually failed on, and a couple of them were like we were trying to like design and code at the same time, and that was problematic because we were constantly context switching. So we were thinking about, all right, how is this like actual UI going to look like? And then we had to think about like how we're going to implement them. And I also think that the lack of vision from us, but also being aligned with the stakeholders kind of made it hard for us to really figure out what we wanted to do. Hence why we did like 17 or 18 iterations of the actual design. And another thing to point out is that we actually frustrated like the engineering team because the actual design was constantly changing. So they actually had to keep on like rebuilding some of the stuff. And that was kind of like one of the things I always like tell people is that when you're prototyping, make sure you have a purpose. And if you have a purpose, and also be able to time box it, because any change from the design standpoint you do is going to affect not only engineering, but also QA and other folks too. So let's talk about the good. So one way you can kind of solve this is to kind of start with a prototype hypothesis. There's many ways to kind of look at this, and a lot of this is kind of taken from the science field, but I'm kind of illustrate like 3 things that should kind of go into this. So the first thing is you have a hypothesis statement, and this is basically stating what you're trying to prototype and basically like what you're trying to prototype and why. Second, we're going to talk about success and failure criteria. So at the end of the prototyping phase and whatnot, you're going to have these like success or failure criteria. So it's either going to be success or failure. And last, we're going to have results. So the results is just going to summarize if it was a success or failure, and then give like a brief summary, like why and maybe next steps. A good way to kind of example of this is there's this article from the Slack engineering blog where they talk about prototyping at Slack, And I think this was a great example because it's pretty short and concise and it's very clear. So they had an idea of doing something, and as you can see, they from the success failure criteria, they're able to kind of they were successful in 2 of them. So overall, it was like success. So this actually makes it easier for anyone that's like having or really thinking about whether a prototype is or idea is good or not, is to kind of create these like success metrics and basically use these as a way to gauge whether the idea is a great or a bad idea. So now that we talked about that, the next one I'm going to tackle is artifacts. The ugly part of like prototypes is that sometimes you create a lot of them, and the ugly will be that there's no organization at all for these prototypes. And a great way to kind of illustrate this is from this diagram, and it basically illustrates like how like the further down like within the feature roadmap and the more designs you add, the more artifacts or prototypes you're going to create. So maybe you're like a small company and maybe you only have like 1 designer and they're creating prototypes, and that's like no problem. But what happens when you scale from 1 to 10 or maybe 10 to 100? There's going to be prototypes everywhere, and sometimes it's going to be hard to keep track where's the prototype, which one's the latest one, and whatnot. The bad would be that you're using multiple products and tools to create prototypes. So I've been in I worked in an environment where some people were using Envision, some people were using Marvel, some people were using coded prototypes. And the idea is that this is like, it's okay because based on like, if you're a smaller team, this might work out. But as you scale, you want to be able to align which tools and products you use. And I always say, like, if you need help as a design team or engineering team around this, definitely chat with, if you have like a design ops a department, to kind of chat with them, because their whole job is to kind of make sure that we streamline the design tools and whatnot. So the good would be to have a centralized place for these prototypes. And one example I have is from MailChimp, where we have a prototype framework called Bench. And the idea is that like anytime someone creates a prototype or whatnot, it automatically gets added to the site. And the great thing about this is that like you'll be able to see everyone's prototype and kind of see the details. So in this view, we're seeing in the card view where it actually provides a screenshot for the actual prototype. But if you go into more of the table view, you get something like this. So you have the project, but also you have when it was last updated, which I think is super important. But another thing is that all these prototypes are version control. So if you wanted to kind of, if you're on like the 24th version of a prototype, you still have access to all the 23 previous iterations. And I think this is important because oftentimes new people get added to the team or people switch teams. And it's always best to kind of communicate like the story of like how the prototype or the idea got to this point. And having them go through each of the iterations, and also if you have any like of those like hypothesis statements where you can kind of see like what were they testing, was it a success or failure, would be helpful, because this actually provides a lot of context for them and they're able to kind of contribute right away. The next is process. So obviously the ugly would be that you have no process at all when you're prototyping. As I was illustrating before, there's been a case where I was just prototyping with no reason and whatnot. And when you have no process, sometimes the actual, you might not accomplish your goal. So you want to be able to have some process. But the bad is too much process. You don't want to be in a case where you have to follow, a 20 checklists of like how to do this stuff and whatnot. So figure out how to like get that balance where you have not a lot of process, but enough process that gives enough structure. So obviously the good would be to kind of have like a clear, concise prototyping process. And I'm big in process, and I think my time working on design systems and a lot of doing like product design is like really figuring out like what process works for you. And one quote that kind of summarized this was from the book called Atomic Habits, and the author is James Clear. And he basically said, we don't rise to our goals, but fall to the levels of our systems. So obviously we all have big goals and we want to make sure that we create the best experience possible. But oftentimes we might fall short. So having process and systems in place will allow us to kind of make sure that we able to accomplish our goals, but also do it where it's effective and efficient. So let's talk about prototype process. And I'm kind of going to talk about the design process, but also kind of talk about things that kind of helped me out during my journey. So we have something like this where we have a design process, and it kind of follows similar to like the scientific method where we often start with a question. So question about what are like, and this might revolve around like a problem for the user. And based on that and the questions, you start going to like the research and you understand more about the user and their pain points and like what they're going through. Then you kind of create a hypothesis where you want to kind of have a statement or a thing you want to be able to test. And as you can see, we have somewhere where we kind of have like this prototyping phase where even in there's like an iterative process where you kind of learn, test, and measure outcomes. And when I say test, you're testing internally before you like go to the next step, which is we test externally. And you kind of, this is a very iterative process, and you might go through this one time. Sometimes you might go through this like iterative process 10 times, but it always depends on the actual idea and project. And another thing I like to use is kind of like the branching exploration. And to kind of summarize this is that all of the great ideas we see always comes from the bad ideas. And I think one discipline that does this pretty well is kind of like the idea of logo design. In some cases, when you look at a logo, you kind of see it and it might be simple, but from the designer standpoint, they probably went through 10, 15, 100 iterations before they got to that one point. And I always like to like communicate to people that like usually like your first idea is usually your worst idea. So be flexible where that if you have a bad idea, like figure out like what is bad about the idea and basically build on top of that. The next thing I want to actually talk about is this diagram, which is called the fuzzy front end or the design squiggly. And the summary of this is that it basically takes you from uncertainty and brings you all the way to clarity. So in the beginning, when you're like starting a project, you might not know a lot about like the business and the users and their pain points. But as you do research and then you synthesize and then you use that findings to kind of create these prototypes, things start to be more clear. And then once you start doing a lot of testing, then you get to that point where it becomes like actual design and something that you can kind of actually ship. One thing I want to communicate off the bat, because I use the design and prototype, and I know they're like two different words, but when you're prototyping, you don't want to get too attached to the design because oftentimes things will change. And even during my time as a product designer, I stopped using the word actual design when I'm talking about like proof of concepts, and I kind of use prototype because when you use design is more of like the final stage, but when you kind of illustrate prototype, it kind of intentionally kind of communicates that it's a work in progress. And I also want to communicate where is that like oftentimes people talk about design is done when they actually like finish a mock-up, but I always tell people that like design isn't finished until it's in production. And this kind of comes from experience where I work hard on like making design pixel perfect and whatnot. And oftentimes because of technical reasons or things change around priorities, designs always have to be adjusted. So I always tell people, especially like people that are coming into the industry now, where it's like, don't get too attached to design until it's actually in production. And even from that, you might have to make some adjustments. One thing I want to talk about there, it's very important, and I think it's sometimes overlooked, is that how we interact with our colleagues. And a lot of the process I like to do is more like a handshake process over handoffs. And one way to kind of illustrate it is like with this diagram. So on the top, we have in a case where we have like a typical waterfall process where design works and then it passes to like development and they kind of build it out. The problem with this is that there might be edge cases that only are uncovered during the development process. And when you're a designer and you kind of pass it off and then an engineer comes back and say, hey, we have this problem, can you fix it? You start to be more reactive with the actual solutions you have. So rather than having this process, you can kind of have something similar to a handshake process where you have design and development working together all from start to finish. The great thing about this is that like it actually allows the designer, this gives a lot of pressure to the designer to kind of come up with the best solution. So they have leeway to kind of make like iterate as they go. And the second thing I would communicate is that this actual like process is scalable. So you can add content strategy, QA and whatnot. And the idea is that like you're working on these like features together in small iterations until you get to like the actual end results. Cool. So the next one I have is tooling. So the ugly for tooling would be not having proper prototyping tooling. And this kind of illustrates where you're trying to prototype something, but things are hard to use. And the idea with prototyping is that speed is essential. So you want to basically be able to take your idea from concept to kind of some sort of completion as quickly as possible. And you can't do that if you don't have the proper tooling in place. The bad side of this is having complex tooling. So you might have a tooling for, let's say, a prototyping, like be able to kind of spin up a prototype, but it's too complex and you spend more time trying to debug the actual tooling versus actually be able to kind of create these concepts and basically test them out. So the good would be to have it where you have a seamless prototyping tooling process. And there's a lot of things that goes into this, and I'm going to highlight a couple of them. The first thing would be you want to basically have a design system that kind of spells out the rules, the guidelines for all of like your UI elements. And these are like the actual coded standpoints, but we also have, you want to have like a UI kit. So basically, if I'm wanting to do like prototype in code, I have the design system, I have the actual code pattern library. But if I want to do it in Figma or something like that, I have like the actual UI kit. And then I'm going to talk about, again, the bench prototype we have at MailChimp. And this kind of allows us to kind of basically publish our prototypes very quickly. And I kind of want to illustrate like this kind of how it would go in natural. So let's say I have like a local version of a prototype. I created this prototype, and then typically what I have to do is just kind of run a command saying bench publish. And basically what's happening is that it's kind of committing all the changes. It's like packaging it up, and then it kind of provides a link to the actual prototype itself. So when I click on this, it actually takes me to a online hosted version of it. And the great thing about this is that I can share this with colleagues and whatnot, and people can kind of give me feedback on like what's working and what's not working. Cool. And the last thing I want to talk about is production. And this is production about like how the prototype is going to work with production. So the ugly will be not utilizing the prototypes for production, which is it's kind of doesn't really make sense, because the idea is that you want to basically have these prototypes to kind of make it easy for designers and developers to kind of build the end results. The bad would be using the raw prototyping method when building for production. So this might be a case, this happened before, where when I was working on the financial application, we kind of were really focusing on like kind of having coded front-end prototypes for all of them. And in some cases, we didn't really need it because some of it was like visual. So rather than kind of maybe instead of using like a coded prototype, we could just kind of have that coded prototype, but also accompany like a static version of it so that the engineers can understand where are the different states for a specific component. The good will always be like you want to be able to leverage the interactive prototype for production. And this is why I love like interactive prototypes, because if you have something where you have this prototype that's built in code and it also leverages the design system, you could literally go from prototype to production very quickly. But the one thing I want to communicate is that oftentimes I've heard where people is like, oh, like this is coded out, cool, let's just kind of take whatever, like copy the code and put it into the actual production code. And that's never a good idea and doesn't work like that. It has to go through a phase of productization. And what this basically is that it's the process of turning a prototype of a design into a version that can be more easily mass produced. So from the digital standpoint, digital product standpoint, if I have like an active prototype, the productization phase would be that I have to write tests for my UI. I have to make sure it's hitting the right API endpoints. I have to refactor some of the code. So that's kind of how it looks like. But the idea is that like as an engineer, I'm not starting from like level from ground zero. I have something that I can like really leverage and make it easy for me to kind of build my actual prototypes. And I mean, not prototypes, but production level. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm kind of leave y'all with 4 takeaways before I wrap up. So the first one I want to talk about is that you want to focus on building the right thing, then the thing right. So when I mean the right thing, I mean you want to build features that bring value to the users. And what I mean by the thing right, I mean you want to make sure that once you figure out the features you want to build, making sure that they're scalable, accessible, and performant. Next is the idea should drive the prototype method. If you're starting a project and you want a prototype, you want to really understand what is your main goal out of this prototype and what's your level of confidence in the idea. And if you have high confidence, then you probably could start with a high fidelity prototyping method. And if you have low confidence, then you want to have something that's more flexible, like a paper prototype. Third, speed is essential when prototyping. So you want to keep this in mind, especially if you're coming up with like a prototyping framework. The faster, the quickest way, if they could start from idea to completion very quickly, this would be very helpful. So making sure that the prototyping tool is available, but also reliable. And last, you want to, before like the prototype, you want to basically create a plan and time box it. So as I was talking about before, having a hypothesis statement is super important, but also time boxing it. So you could say like, all right, I'm going to prototype for 2 weeks or 4 weeks. And then at the end, you kind of figure out whether the last prototype is a success or failure. And if it's a success, then you can kind of move forward to doing A/B testing or put into production. If it's a failure, then you just kind of go back to the drawing board and repeat. So I know that was a lot for 45 minutes, but if you want to learn more, I actually worked on a design engineering handbook with Natalia Schönborn, Kim Williams, and Eddie Liu. My chapter is mostly focusing on design engineering process, which it's more lines of prototyping and different prototyping methods. So definitely check that out. And yeah, thanks for listening.
Oh, wow. Excellent. That was a great talk. Now, I don't know about you, but every time I have like processes and workflows, I feel like that was incredible. Thank you so much, Adekunle, for a really nice, like meaty, real life session. That was really, really incredible. Now, first of all, we have a lot of questions that came in, so I will have to go through all of them, I'm afraid. But even if I don't pick up, dear friends, don't worry. I think that Adekunle will also be available for a short while in the Q&A later, so you can bring up your questions as well, right? But tons of questions. Now, first of all, how are you feeling? Like, it was like a lot of content in 45 minutes. You just went on and all different methodologies and all. Are you okay? Like,
Yeah, I'm good. I think, especially for this talk, I was trying to like illustrate this story about like how I got to it, but I wanted to make sure that I provided some story and context of like all the things I went through, and kind of like you talked about it earlier about like failures. I think I failed a lot through this process where it was like, as you can see by that like that GIF I had where I was like, we did 18 iterations and whatnot, and we were just prototyping just to prototype, but we didn't really have like actual purpose of like why we wanted to prototype and like and what's like the end goal. So I want to illustrate like those are like things I failed at, but these are the like the ways that I kind of saw that, and hopefully anyone that's going through it, they can kind of like reference this and like, oh, okay, maybe I could like have like start with like a hypothesis before I start prototyping and whatnot. So
oh yes, totally. I mean, I could tell that was just incredible. And I think that the round of here's a challenge: a prototype related emoji. That would be interesting to see. It would be in order as clapping. In the meantime, though, maybe just a few questions in here. One question came in early from Andre Janisch. And then Andrew was wondering how much the collocation of a team influences the choice of a prototype methodology. For example, if you're working remote, how would you even use pen and paper? I personally count whiteboard sketching to the same cohort like pen and paper. If needed, that's easy to record as photos and it's erasable. So in this wonderful world that we're living, where everybody is in their own four walls, do you see pen and paper still a thing, or is it, how do you make it work in the scope of let's say large scale project where you have like a big team, distributed team?
I actually think like you always should start with pen and paper, and this is more lines of coming from when I was an artist where like I did a lot of paintings, and it was like what I often would try to do is like I start with the paintbrush, but I always get like boxed in a corner when I do that. So even in this digital world, what we can kind of do is that like personally, I could like sketch my ideas out or whatever like that. And then if I want to collaborate with anyone that's like, let's say a colleague or whatever like that, I can kind of take a picture of it and then use like Figma or something like that and kind of like have, and you can even create like these like prototypes with just using images. And then people can kind of give you comments and whatnot. So I kind of do where it's like a best of both worlds, where I always start with sketch, especially if I'm like doing by myself, and then kind of use like Figma to kind of be able to kind of collaborate with other people. And I also did it in the past too, where we did it where we had like those like video cameras that like are looking at like what we're sketching, and then people can kind of get feedback on that. So I think there's many ways to kind of do it, especially in this new world, and we're probably going to be like this for a while, but you always want to start with the pen and paper and then gradually scale up if needed.
Okay, that makes sense. There were also a couple of questions, of course, about bench, and I love this idea of versing prototyping and having some sort of a framework in place where you can get access to all of them, kind of a central repository. A while back, I think maybe it was 5 years ago, Dan Moll was presenting a talk in which he was mentioning something like that, which I believe named kind of similar, but essentially for sketches, for early sketches. And I kind of really like this idea. The question, of course, is it by any chance going to be open source? Is it something like a branded product that's specifically designed and created for MailChimp needs? Is it something that you create for every, like the question came specifically from Jolly, is Bench a rebranded product or something that's really built in-house?
So yeah, it's an in-house product, and I always had this idea of like creating a bench prototype, but I probably lack the technical expertise to do it. So actually, one of my colleagues from NASDAQ, Daniel Espizet, he actually created it, I think in the span of like 3 weeks. And it's not open source because it's tied into using GCP and GitHub. So there's a lot of like things that happen in the back end that's like we're like it's allowing you doing stuff. So I think it would be hard to open source, but I think the concept of the idea is like I think it's a way for people to kind of be able to implement it for their team. So ideas like where, you know, if you have a simple script, it just kind of does all like the Git and then publishing it and whatnot. But I'm gonna have like an article about like how to do so. But short answer, it's not open source. But hopefully in the future, maybe I'm able to kind of create like a demo for it. Possible.
Please, and maybe write a book or maybe a bunch of articles or video courses or anything like that. It'd be really, really great to kind of get more insights into that. We are a little bit out of time here, but we will have enough time in the session, which I would like to invite Adekunle in to join us as well, where you can bring up your questions as well. And so with that, I think thank you so much, Adekunle, for joining in. You can proceed if you have a moment to the sessions where I believe you are being expected already. And please, everyone, give a really nice warm round of well, snowman emoji. I think that would be the best one for Adekunle for the wonderful, wonderful session on prototyping.
Yeah. So one thing I think people have a question about is like the bench product we have at MailChimp. And I could kind of illustrate the story of how that came. But the idea was that like we had this like redesign and we needed to kind of figure out how to effectively prototype the new designs, but also be able to share them out. And that's where like my colleague Daniel kind of created the kind of the bench framework. And a couple of things about it is that there's it allows like anyone to kind of produce prototypes. But let's say if our colleague created a prototype and I wanted to kind of use that or kind of and make it my own. There's a couple of commands, and there's one command called remix. So a remix is that I'm able to kind of take someone's prototype and basically make it my own, so I can make their own changes and whatnot. And I think that's a great way to kind of think about it, because as I was talking, illustrated in the talk, the idea of like branching exploration, where you're building off of previous ideas, that kind of allowed anyone to kind of build off anyone ideas and whatnot. And the other cool thing about it is that you could use the prototypes for user testing. As I talked before, a lot of the stuff we have, especially the prototypes, is hosted on GCP. So there were like some stuff we had to go through to kind of making sure that, let's say I want to kind of have this prototype and test it with other people. I'm able to kind of I'm able to share the link, and we have a thing where it's like the link will expire within 48 hours. So that was a kind of a pretty good tool for us, because I feel like it allowed us to kind of we didn't have to like do stuff within like the actual product. We were able to kind of have spin up our own like environment locally, and then basically do some things and basically brainstorm and create these new and crazy ideas, and basically publish them so people can kind of see. And then makes it easier so that if I need to find a prototype I've done in the past, we had like a search bar where we're able to kind of search for specific prototypes based on author or the title of the prototype. So, but yeah. Yeah, I think there's a video away, so I don't know if anyone has like more questions or they want to ask in the chat, but if you weren't using Bench, what setup would you be using? Yeah, great question, Dak. So kind of how I've done in the past is that I usually use some sort of static site generator to kind of build my prototypes. So what I've been using recently is I use Gatsby, or maybe probably in the future I use Next.js, but and combine that with like Netlify. So I'm able to kind of create prototypes and then just kind of publish it using Netlify, and then Netlify kind of spits out that link that I can kind of share with people, which I think is pretty cool. The problem with that is that you have like it's not hosted on our servers, so I think that was the reason why we kind of didn't go that route. Even for simple, some of the websites we had, like the design system documentation, it was built on Gatsby, but we had there's always issues around like security and whatnot. So I would use like Gatsby, but then if I wanted to kind of do something very quickly, then I'll use Figma, and I think Figma is a great tool to kind of collaborate with others and whatnot. But yeah, great question. Are there any other questions, thoughts, ideas? Oh, and I think one thing the last thing I kind of can indicate is how like when I was doing like mostly product design work, I was doing a lot of prototyping, and how I started doing more design system work was that there was not much tooling around like being able to kind of create hard to do. So that's kind of how like I got into part like the design systems, which was around like 6 or 7 years ago. Because the idea was like I was frustrated by like not being able to kind of take my ideas and put them out, but kind of design system and prototyping goes hand to hand. Jacqueline got a question. We are restricted to working on Windows 7, which restricts the software we can use. Currently, we use Acture, but when we upgrade our OS, which would you recommend we look at? Yeah, great question. I'm not too familiar with Windows, but yeah, I'm not familiar with it. So I don't have a good answer. But I assume that a lot of the like JS frameworks work in Windows, if I'm not mistaken. So like Gatsby, Next.js, or anything like that should work. Again, I'm not familiar with it. But even if that's not working, I think Figma has good support, especially being a web-based product. So that's why I'm a big fan of it, because when I was using Sketch, it was hard to like work with people like that had Windows machines. So even in the case where you can't have like a super interactive prototype, be able to collaborate with that, having something that's web-based will be helpful. I haven't seen people do it where they use like a code pen or something to kind of create these prototypes. So CodePen or Code Sandbox. So I would say that too. So, but great question. Yeah, no problem. Jacqueline had a question. Have you done much usability testing with static prototypes? Yes, I have. And I think it works in like in certain situations. But I realized that when I was doing a lot of static prototyping and using it for usability testing, oftentimes what happens like users want to click to like other portions of the application, but they can't because it's just like a static mockup or not. So that's kind of why I love the idea of like having interactive prototype that's like built out in like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The reason being is that like let's say we have 5 teams that are building features, and it kind of follows similar to like engineering process where you have this master prototype, and basically, if I'm working a feature, I'm able to build that feature and then put it back into the master prototype. So in the sense of like if you have one master prototype, you could literally go out, do some user testing, and allow people to kind of like test drive their experience, and like they might visit other portions of the application, which is totally fine. And you kind of to take that a step level where you can kind of have like a static version of a you have a static version of the data of like let's say I'm doing a product and one of my clients is like Coca-Cola. We can kind of take their data, put it into the actual prototype, and that could kind of illustrate the real experience. So do you think user testing with prototypes or early rollout and agile dev are better? I would say you could do both. So you could do user testing, but in a way where like you want to test as early as possible. So even if you have to do like if I'm doing like a paper type, you can kind of do some sort of like guerrilla testing to kind of get feedback on like how like if whatever you're coming up with is kind of solving people's problems. And then from there, let's say we kind of create like a high fidelity prototype, or we can then use that as a way to kind of do some A/B testing. So maybe we want to test out like the solution with like 10% of the audience and get some feedback about like how they're using it. And the idea is like you're testing it, like you're getting 2 types of tests. So you're getting like more of qualitative data when you're doing the user testing because you're actually sitting with the audience, with the user and kind of getting feedback. And then when you do like an early rollout, you're getting more of a quantitative. So you're getting like what their actual behavior is. And I think you could use those 2 basic information and figure out if the feature that you built is actually solving people's problems. So I think you can use both. I'm a big fan of both. I'm especially a big fan of like early rollout because I think sometimes we spend way too much time trying to make sure that we have the best experience possible. And I'm more in a case of like just kind of putting the stuff out there and iterate as we go. But yeah, that was a great question. And I'll share the link to the handbook. I created chapter 2, which illustrates more. It kind of takes what I was talking about during this talk and just kind of more of a deeper dive into each of them, especially the principles, because I think the principles I outlined is super important and something that I wasn't thinking of early in my career, but I know that I don't do like much prototyping right now, but I know like when I do, I'm always having those principles in mind, and making sure that I do have like a plan and goal for when I'm prototype, like what's the outcome, what I'm trying to test and whatnot. And a lot of it just coming from the scientific method and whatnot. So, but yeah, are there any other questions? Oh, Jacqueline has a question. When demoing prototypes to internal teams, support, marketing, etc., what do you find the best format for getting good feedback? Yeah, great question. So kind of how I've done in the past is that I make sure that I always have um, some colleague that's in someone like I could like talk to like quarterly or whatnot. So I could like talking about like some of the pain points and whatnot, and kind of have someone that I could like share prototypes ideas with, and then get them to give feedback. So, for example, one of my jobs, I kind of shadowed a customer support person, and just to kind of, I was asking him a bunch of questions, especially the one I was working on. And I was working on a HR product, and I was focusing mostly on healthcare benefits. So I was asking a lot of questions about like, what are some of the questions people were getting and whatnot. And once I kind of had like a prototype, I basically just kind of sent her like the prototype, and I was like, asked for feedback, and she was like, "Oh, this is awesome." She was like, they might be feel confused about this and that, and that was very helpful because that allowed me to not only um, get feedback, but I was able to kind of iterate quicker. And I think, especially with support, they're underutilized because they talk to the users more often than product managers and product designers. So if they hear a lot of people complaining about certain stuff, they're going to know what's going to work and what's not going to work. So definitely having a strong connection with support is good. I think also with marketing and anyone else, you basically just want to have like champions and people that you can kind of talk to and just kind of work with. And I feel like really like if you're a designer, engineer, you should definitely have a lot of like colleagues that that could like you could talk to and bring ideas to, and then to give you feedback. And if I feel like the best way to do that is to kind of have like a prototype and have them get feedback. So you use Figma and a bunch of stuff, but I realized that like that's probably the best way to do it. And sometimes I just schedule like a 30-minute chat where I could kind of walk them through their prototype and provide them a lot with like context. And then from there, they could give me feedback. So there's a lot of ways to kind of do it. So, but hopefully that answers your question, Jacqueline. Dak, you have a question. What tools did you use to prototype that insane financial app? How long did it take? Yeah, so that was actually 5 years ago. So it was like a homegrown like prototype framework, and I think it was built off of Knockout JS and PHP, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, it was like we just basically developed that ourselves. Again, the code wasn't too efficient because we were using different frameworks compared to our engineering colleagues. So even though it was fun, it was pretty wasteful in certain cases because when the engineer got like the actual like coded prototype, what ended up happening was that they actually had to rebuild like probably like 90% of it. So they probably didn't rebuild like the CSS, but like the HTML, the markup, and they actually had to rebuild it from scratch, which was like looking back, that was kind of not a useful thing. So that's why I was kind of talking about like that's why I was kind of thinking of like making sure there's like close linkage between what you have as an interactive prototype and the actual production, and how I was talking about before, where um, you have like once you have a prototype and you want to put it into production, it's going to go through this like productionization phase where you will kind of do some refactoring, you write some unit tests, integration tests, and whatnot, hook up some endpoints, and then you can kind of get it out to the door. And that process is usually quicker once you have like a design system in place and have like a good like prototyping framework, if that makes sense. Hopefully that answered your question. But it probably took us like a couple years to kind of come up with that framework, and we just kind of we kind of had a proof of concept, and then we just iterate as we go. So in a sense, the prototype framework was a product itself that we were prototyping as we went. But yeah, that was a great question. And then to kind of illustrate more uh, that financial product that I was working on, the great thing was that we're using static data. So like throughout those like 18 or 17 iterations of it, we were kind of designing around the actual data, which that kind of changed the way I work. That's how I got into like data viz, was that like once you the one of the key rules when you're doing data viz is like go through the data, understand the data, and that kind of allowed me to kind of really think about like, oh, we put the data on the screen and design around that. Jacqueline has another question. What is your favorite prototype you've done and why? Yeah, I would say that like that financial the prototype I was doing for the financial product was probably my favorite project because I felt like it was working with a great team, and I think if you have like a great group of people, you could basically do anything. And it was probably one of the most like stressful things because I felt like I knew a lot about like design and code, but when I was like part of that team, it was like there were people like that were so much better than me. But it was it was great. It was like stressful. Like we were like pushing out like new ideas like every week, every 2 weeks, and getting feedback on it. But I would say that was probably like my favorite one of my favorite projects I worked on, and that was probably the prototype. But also, it did have its drawbacks because I think it was like I was learning a lot and didn't know much. But I would say that was like my favorite project. So hopefully that answers your question. Dak has a question. New tools, but what did you use for all the charting and graphing? Yeah, great question. So we started out using Zing charts. I don't know if it's like still a thing. Zing charts. Like I said, this was like a couple years back. Actually, they're still a thing. Yeah, so Zing charts because it was super easy to kind of create charts, and then we eventually graduated to using D3. And the reason why we use D3 because it was like it gives more control. So, but I would say like if you like needed to like do something very quickly, Zing charts or anything else will be fine. Because I know like there's a learning curve for using D3. And I think with Zing charts it was like it was very easy. All you had to do is like put the data in, and it'll kind of figure all that stuff out. But for more complex charts, you probably want to use something that you'll be able to kind of customize. So that's where you use D3. But yeah, great question. Jacqueline has a question. How big are the teams you work with? Yeah, so usually right now I'm part of a design system team, and it consists of 4 engineers, 2 designers, 1 engineer manager, and 1 designer. And that was like when I'm working on a design system team. I think a couple months back, I was working on like a navigation feature for MailChimp, and that was around like 10 people, and it would consist of content strategy, 3 engineers, engineer manager, a designer, a QA person, and whatnot. And yeah, and I would say like I always enjoy working with cross-functional teams because it's always I think when you have people that have different set of skills, you usually want to be able to, it's always the best to kind of collaborate them. And I'm always a big fan of people having multiple skills. So I worked with designers that know how to code. I worked with designers that knew content strategy. I worked with product managers that were designers. And I think working with more cross-functional teams is definitely you're able to like collaborate more efficiently, but the end result is always better. So, but yeah. Yeah, I think that's how like teams are going right now, which I think is great. And I think we're kind of making another push where we're not only going from a cross functioning team to individuals having cross functional skills. So like the idea of like design engineers or having a case where full stack engineers or having content people that are like designers is definitely helpful. So yeah. Oh yeah, that's great. Yeah, I always that's the one thing I recommend. Like even right now, what I'm trying to push for is like to kind of have a QA and a content person to be part of the design system team. But um, it's always hard, so that's why I working with people like unofficially. But I think having those people that have those like talents, especially with the content, super important when dealing with design systems, but also for products because when people are using your products, they're not using it for the design; they're using for the information you're providing them. So it's always content is always first, content is always king. So yeah, I think that's the best way to do it. How I learned content or even data viz, I learned it from someone else. I was working in college. She was the data viz expert. I thought I knew data viz until I met her, and I was like, oh, I don't know anything about it. So I was like, okay. So I learned a ton from her. I learned, and from me working with her, it probably would have taken me years to kind of really have a good understanding of like data viz. So I always tell people that like to definitely work with other people, understand what they're going through. And I know like working on design systems, this is what I've done a lot where I talk to anyone to kind of get a good understanding of like what their day to day is like, what are their pain points, and really understanding um, if they have any problems, like figure out how like the design system can kind of provide any value, and also figure out like how what I'm doing could kind of push them forward to their goals. And I think that's a great way to kind of looking at things. So yeah, this is fun. Yeah, thanks again. If anyone, if you have any questions after the this conference, feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn or Twitter. Let me put my information. Yeah, feel free to hit me up. I'm definitely thinking about doing more of like a prototyping workshop. And if people are interested in that, I'm interested in it, but I don't know how many people are interested in it. So if people feel like it's a good thing, maybe I could come back to Smash and do some sort of workshop in the future.